Stop. Before you do anything else right now, I need you to think about something. There are two kinds of retirees I have watched navigate this passage, and the difference between them is not money, not health, not planning. The difference is whether they understood, while they were standing inside the go-go years, that the go-go years were what they were standing in. One of them used that window. The other spent it waiting to feel ready, waiting for the timing to improve, waiting for a better moment that was always just a few months away. And by the time that second retiree understood what she had been waiting inside, the window had quietly moved, not closed, just moved. And some of what was possible at 63 was no longer quite possible at 73. My name is Linda Calloway. I spent 27 years in human resources helping other people understand the transitions they were living through. And then I retired, and I became the second kind of retiree. I am finally going to say out loud what nobody in this conversation seems willing to say. The window is shorter than you think, and most of us don't know we're inside it until we're looking back at it. If that landed somewhere real for you, subscribe and hit the bell. This conversation needs to keep going, and I'd rather not have it alone. Before we go any further, write in the comments one thing you wish someone had told you before you retired. Or if you're not there yet, one thing you're afraid nobody is going to tell you. I read every single one. Be ready for what you're about to hear. I have a friend named Carol. She turned 74 last spring, and we had dinner at her house to celebrate. Nothing elaborate, just a few of us who've known each other for years, sitting around a table that has seen a lot of meals and a lot of conversation. At some point in the evening, Carol said something, very quietly, the way you say something you've already made peace with, but haven't said out loud before. She said, "I kept waiting until I had more energy, and then I didn't have more energy. I just had less time." Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. Carol wasn't being dramatic. She's not a dramatic person. She said it the way you describe the weather, factually, without self-pity, with the particular calm of someone who has accepted something they cannot change. And then the conversation moved on, the way conversations do. But I couldn't move on from it. I drove home that night, turning her words over and over. Because Carol is not someone who squandered her retirement. She planned it. She was careful. She made sensible decisions. And still, somewhere in the space between 62 and 74, a window had quietly closed that she hadn't fully seen while she was standing inside it. I want to talk about that window today, not because this is a story about regret. It isn't. It's a story about something I think most of us understand somewhere in the back of our minds, but haven't let ourselves fully receive. The go-go years of retirement are real. The window is real. And the window does not stay open indefinitely, no matter how carefully you've planned or how good your intentions are. That is what I want to name today. That is what I couldn't stop thinking about on the drive home from Carol's house, and what I've been sitting with ever since. Let me back up for a moment and say something about that phrase, go-go years. If you've ever sat across a desk from a financial planner, you've probably heard it. It's a term from retirement planning, used to describe the first phase of retirement, roughly the decade or so after you leave work. when you're still healthy, still mobile, still able to do things that require energy. The go-go years, they say, are when you spend more. Then come the slow-go years, then the no-go years. The whole framework is financial. It's about cash flow and withdrawal rates, and what your spending curve will look like across a 30-year retirement. I am not a financial advisor. I want to be clear about that, and then I want to move past it, because the financial version of this idea is not what I came to talk about today. What I came to talk about is the human version, the version nobody mentions when they're drawing the curve on the whiteboard. The version Carol was describing at her birthday dinner when she said, "I kept waiting until I had more energy." The human version of the go-go years is something I have come to understand as a window, not a phase in a financial model, an actual window, the kind that has a frame and a sill and is only open for a certain amount of time. The window is the years when your body is still substantially cooperating, when travel doesn't require elaborate medical logistics, when you can decide on a Wednesday that you want to do something on Friday and actually do it, when spontaneity is still available to you as a practical matter, not just a romantic idea. And when the nervous system that spent 3 or 4 decades running on professional adrenaline has finally, slowly begun to release enough of that load that you can actually be present for the life you're living. Both of those things being true at once, the body cooperating, the nervous system releasing, is not permanent. That's what I didn't understand when I retired at 61. I thought I was entering a long, open stretch of time. In some ways I was, but I was also in the window, whether I knew it or not, and I spent a significant portion of the early part of it waiting. How many of you know what I mean by waiting? Not waiting for anything specific, just waiting. Waiting until you feel settled enough in retirement to do the thing you always meant to do. Waiting until the timing is a little better. Waiting until the grandchildren's schedules clear up. Waiting until your spouse is ready, or your health is more certain, or your finances feel more stable, or you feel more confident that you know what you're doing in this new chapter. The waiting always has a reason. Every individual reason is entirely reasonable. But the accumulation of reasonable reasons is how the go-go years go by. I know this because I did it. I had a plan when I retired. I want to tell you about the plan because the plan is important to understanding what I got wrong. I was an HR director for 27 years, the last 9 of them running HR for a regional healthcare system, 4 hospitals, more than 3,000 employees. If there was one thing I knew how to do, it was design a transition. I knew the research. I knew the frameworks. I had helped hundreds of people navigate professional change. And I understood, in a structural way, what the research said about successful retirement transitions. So I made a plan. It was thorough. It had categories. Travel, several specific trips Tom and I had talked about for years. Volunteering, I'd identified an organization that seemed like a good fit. More time with our daughters. Watercolors, I had always wanted to try watercolors, and what I privately called finally reading all the books, which was a somewhat grandiose way of describing the stack on my nightstand. The plan lasted 11 weeks. By month 4, I had abandoned the watercolors. I was bad at them and found that genuinely irritating in a way I hadn't expected. I'd stepped back from the volunteer organization because it had structural problems I kept trying to fix and couldn't, which was its own kind of irony. The travel hadn't happened yet because we were waiting for a better time. And I was sitting in my living room with a lot of very good intentions and absolutely no idea what I was actually doing. Tom one evening said, "You're circling. You've been circling for months. What are you actually looking for?" I didn't have an answer. That question stayed with me for a long time. And what I realize now, looking back, is that the circling was a form of waiting. I was inside the window, and I was waiting for the window to feel like itself, waiting to feel ready, waiting to feel settled, waiting for retirement to feel like what I thought it was supposed to feel like before I actually lived it. That cost me time I didn't get back. Not catastrophic amounts, but real amounts. And what I learned from Carol is that the accumulation is what you need to watch. Not any single week of waiting, the accumulation. There is something specific that happens with the go-go years that I think is genuinely hard to see while you're living it. And it's this. The narrowing doesn't announce itself. There is no morning when you wake up and the window is visibly smaller. It's not dramatic. It's not a diagnosis or a crisis or a turning point you can point to afterward and say that was when things changed. The narrowing is incremental. It's a Tuesday that is slightly different from the Tuesday before it, and a Wednesday that is slightly different from the Wednesday before that. And then one day you are trying to plan the trip you've been meaning to take, and the conversation goes a little differently than it would have gone 4 years earlier. I watched this happen with my mother. She retired at 64. The first 4 years she was genuinely unstoppable. More energy than she'd had at 50, she said, because she wasn't spending energy on things she didn't choose. She traveled. She took classes. She picked up relationships she'd let go thin during the working years. She was living inside her go-go years fully, and she knew it, which is the thing I wish I had understood better at the time. By 71, the logistics had shifted. Not dramatically, but she noticed them. Travel required more planning. Her sleep was different. The recovery time after a big trip was longer than it had been. None of this was catastrophic. None of it closed the window entirely. But the window had moved, in the way windows do when you're not watching them specifically. What I took from watching her, and from the conversation with Carol, and from my own first years of retirement, is that the people who use the go-go years fully are almost always the people who understood, while they were in them, that they were in them. That sounds obvious. It is not obvious. It is genuinely hard to know, from inside, what window you're standing in. I want to tell you about a woman named Patricia. We worked together for about 12 years. She was in HR at another organization in our network. And we became the kind of professional friends who have lunch a few times a year and are actually honest with each other in a way you can't always be with the people inside your own building. Patricia retired 2 years before I did. She was 63. She went into it with, as far as I could tell, the right approach. She knew herself. She had interests outside of work. She had a good marriage and a clear sense of what she wanted the next chapter to look like. We had lunch about 18 months after she retired, and she said something that I've repeated to myself many times since. She said, "I thought the go-go years were about having enough money. I didn't realize they were about having enough body." She didn't mean that as a dark statement. She wasn't describing illness or limitation. She was describing something subtler. the specific physical aliveness of being in the years when your body is still fully on board with your life. The years when you can walk for 3 hours and feel good afterward. When the heat in a foreign city in August is manageable, not punishing. When your joints cooperate for the hike you planned, and your energy holds for the evening after the hike, and you don't need 2 days to recover from the thing you just did that you loved. Patricia was still very much in that season when we had lunch, but she had started to feel its edges in a way she hadn't at 63. And what she said she wished she had understood earlier was not to save up for the go-go years. She had done that. What she wished she had understood was to actually be in them, not waiting to be in them, not managing them from a careful distance, but actually inside them, spending the aliveness while it was still fully there. I spent the drive home from that lunch thinking about what I had spent the first 1.5 years of my own go-go years doing. And the honest answer was mostly managing, waiting, circling, as Tom would say, planning trips I hadn't taken, deferring decisions I could have made, living inside a window and treating it as if it were a wall, as if the thing I was waiting for was permission I hadn't yet received. What I have come to understand 3 years in is that the go-go years are not asking you to do everything. They're not a bucket list assignment or a performance of activity or a race against a clock you have to win. That framing is too thin and too anxious, and it doesn't match the actual texture of what I've seen in the women who are using their go-go years well. What they are asking, and this is what I couldn't articulate for a long time, but I can now, is that you be here for the life you actually have. At the level of attention and presence your career never quite allowed. The go-go years are the years when both conditions are true simultaneously. The body is cooperating and the nervous system is releasing. The nervous system that spent decades in professional mode, alert, scheduled, responsible, producing, is slowly, finally, beginning to let go of that structure. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous shift. And it has a window, too. The window when the releasing is still happening, when the healing is still available, when the body catching up with the decision is still ongoing. That window is the go-go years, and it is more precious than any number drawn on a financial planning whiteboard. I want to stop for a moment and just say that directly. The go-go years are not about money. They are not about activity levels or bucket lists or spending curves. They are about the specific season of retirement when you are physically capable and psychologically present enough to actually inhabit your own life. When the tiredness of the working years has finally lifted enough that you can feel what's underneath it. When the people you love are still here in the way they are here right now. When the places you've meant to go are still places you can go the way you always imagined going them. That season has edges. It has a shape. And most people I have watched navigate this, including myself for the first good while, did not fully receive that information while they were inside the season. What changes when you do receive it is not dramatic. You don't suddenly become a different person. You don't throw out all the caution and the reasonable reasons and book everything on a Tuesday. That's not what I'm describing. What I'm describing is quieter and more permanent than that. What changes is that you stop keeping the things that matter most in the later drawer. Tom asked me about a specific trip, not the philosophical question about what I was looking for, a different question, a much more concrete one about a place we had talked about going for years. He said, "If not now, when?" I sat with that question for 3 days because I didn't have a good answer. I had reasons. The reasons were reasonable. But I noticed, sitting with the question, that the reasons were not actually why we hadn't gone. The reasons were stories I had been telling myself while I waited for a feeling of readiness that was never going to arrive on its own. We went. I'm not going to tell you the trip was transformative or that something profound happened. It was a very good trip. What I remember most is not a moment of revelation, but the absence of the low-level hum of deferral that I had been living with for longer than I'd admitted. The trip happened because I finally stopped waiting for the right conditions and recognized that I was already in them. That is the thing Carol was describing at her birthday dinner. Not the specific trip she didn't take, the pattern, the waiting, the accumulation of reasonable reasons inside a window she didn't fully see while she was standing in it. Carol is fine. I want to say that clearly. She is 74 years old, and she has a full life, and she is not someone I pity or worry about in any deep way. What she felt, naming that thing at her birthday dinner, was not devastation. It was the specific feeling of someone making honest peace with something she wished she'd understood earlier. There's a difference between that and tragedy. But there is also something important in the honesty, something worth receiving before the peace is the only option left. So here is what I want to leave you with. You are in a window. If you are in your early 60s or your late 50s, and you are either newly retired or approaching retirement, you are in the window. The window is open. The question is not whether the window will eventually change. It will. The question is what you are doing with it while it's open. The protection against losing the go-go years is not a system or a 5-step plan. I've made several very thorough plans at this point in my life, and they have a way of lasting approximately 11 weeks. What protects the window is simpler than a plan. It is the habit of naming, honestly and regularly, what you are keeping in the later drawer. What is in there that you actually mean, that you would genuinely mourn if the window moved before you got to it? Not everything in the drawer, one thing, the most important one, and then stopping the waiting, not for all of it, but for that. Tom's question, if not now, when, is not a comfortable question. I recommend it anyway. Before the end of this week, not next month, this week, I want you to name one thing that is living in your later drawer. Just name it. Write it down somewhere. You don't have to do it tomorrow. You don't have to book the flight or make the call or begin the project by Friday. But stop pretending you have unlimited time to decide. Because the go-go years are not asking you to do everything. They are asking you to do the things that matter most, while you are still the person who can. Write something in the comments for me. I want to know what's in your later drawer, the thing you've been keeping there not because it's impossible, but because you've been waiting for a condition that hasn't quite arrived. Tell me what it is. I read every single one, and what I have found in the comments on this channel is that women naming these things out loud, even just to a stranger on a screen, is itself a form of taking them seriously. It is, in its own small way, a form of beginning. If what you heard today felt true to something you've been living, if Carol's words or Patricia's or Tom's question landed somewhere real, I'd be glad to have you subscribe. This channel is not a large operation. It's a conversation between people who are in this same passage, trying to be honest about what it actually looks like. Hit the bell if you want to know when the next conversation is here. And if this one helped, share it with one person you know who might be standing inside this window right now without quite realizing it. Carol knew it by 74. I started to know it around year 2. My mother knew it from almost the first day she retired, which is something I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about lately. What she understood about the preciousness of the window that took me so much longer to understand myself. The room is this one. The time is now. The window is open. Go use it.